September 16th, 1992. 7:43 in the morning. London, England. The city had not yet fully woken. Black cabs rolled through damp streets. The Thames caught the gray light of an overcast sky. Somewhere in the corridors of the Treasury on Horse Guards Road, a telephone had already been ringing for hours. And inside the gilded machinery of one of the world's oldest financial institutions, the Bank of England, men in dark suits were beginning to understand, with cold, creeping certainty, that they were losing a war they did not yet know had been declared. This is the story of one man, one trade, and one single day that reshaped the global financial order forever. This is the story of how George Soros broke the Bank of England and walked away with $1 billion before the sun went down. To understand what happened on that Wednesday morning in September 1992, you must first understand the world that made it possible. Europe, in the early 1990s, was a continent trying to stitch itself together. The Cold War had ended, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and European leaders, filled with post-war ambition and political optimism, were pushing hard for a unified economic future. The centerpiece of that vision was something called the Exchange Rate Mechanism, or the ERM. It was an agreement among European nations to keep their currencies trading within fixed bands against one another, a kind of financial corset designed to hold European economies in alignment ahead of a future single currency. On the surface, it looked like stability. Underneath, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. Britain had joined the ERM in October 1990 under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, reluctantly at what many economists privately considered a dangerously overvalued rate for the pound sterling. When John Major took over as Prime Minister shortly after, he inherited not just Thatcher's office, but her mistake. The pound was locked into the ERM at a rate of 2.95 Deutsche Marks, and to stay there, Britain was obligated to keep its interest rates aligned with German rates. But Germany, flush with the enormous costs of reunification, had raised its interest rates aggressively. Britain, meanwhile, was crawling through a recession. High interest rates were the last thing a struggling British economy needed, and yet, bound by the ERM, that is precisely what John Major's government was forced to maintain. The contradiction was visible to anyone with eyes. A currency being held artificially high, an economy desperately weak, a government politically committed to a policy its own fundamentals could not support. Most economists could see it. Most analysts could see it. But it was one man, sitting in a midtown Manhattan office tower, surrounded by screens and telephones and the quiet hum of one of the most powerful private investment funds on earth, who decided to act on what he saw. George Soros was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1930. He survived the Nazi occupation of his country as a child, watched his world collapse, and eventually escaped to London, where he studied at the London School of Economics under the philosopher Karl Popper. Popper's theory of fallibilism, the idea that human understanding is always incomplete, always open to being proven wrong, would become the philosophical backbone of everything Soros did with money for the rest of his life. He called his own investment philosophy reflexivity, the idea that markets are not rational systems that move toward equilibrium, but deeply human systems, constantly shaped by the beliefs and biases of the people operating within them. And beliefs, Soros understood better than almost anyone alive, could be shattered. By 1992, Soros managed the Quantum Fund, one of the largest and most aggressive hedge funds on the planet. It had made him extraordinarily wealthy. But it was not Soros who first spotted the opportunity in the British pound. That credit belongs to his chief strategist, a lean, intense man named Stanley Druckenmiller. Druckenmiller had been studying the British economic situation with the focused obsession of a chess player reading the board 12 moves ahead. He could see the fundamental misalignment between the pound's ERM-mandated value and the true state of the British economy. He could see that the British government was trapped, unable to raise interest rates without deepening the recession, unable to lower them without abandoning the ERM. And he could see that the trap had only one exit: devaluation. Britain would eventually have to let the pound fall. The only question was when, and whether anyone was bold enough to place that bet before the inevitable happened. Druckenmiller brought the idea to Soros in the summer of 1992. The initial plan was to short approximately $1.5 billion worth of British pounds, a massive bet by any measure, structured to profit if and when the pound fell in value. Soros listened. He looked at the analysis, and then he did something that stunned even Druckenmiller. He told his strategist to go bigger, much bigger, not $1.5 billion, $10 billion. George Soros was going to bet $10 billion against the British pound. To bet against a currency is to sell it, to borrow it, sell it at the current price, and wait for the price to drop so you can buy it back cheaper and pocket the difference. It is a cold mathematical transaction. But to do it at the scale Soros was contemplating, against the currency of one of the world's major economies, backed by the full institutional force of the Bank of England, was something else entirely. It was a declaration of war against a sovereign government, and Soros was not the only one who had read the battlefield. Through August and into early September 1992, the pressure on the pound had been building quietly, steadily, like water rising behind a dam. Currency traders across Europe and North America were watching the same numbers Druckenmiller was watching. Some were already positioning themselves to profit from a British devaluation. The German Bundesbank, under its formidable president Helmut Schlesinger, had made clear, in public and in private, that it saw no room to cut German interest rates in order to ease the pressure on its ERM partners. On September 15, 1992, the day before the storm, a German newspaper published remarks attributed to Schlesinger, suggesting that the ERM needed restructuring and that the pound, along with other currencies, was overvalued. The article set off a cascade. By the evening of September 15th, currency traders around the world had read the signal. The hunt for the pound had begun in earnest. September 16, 1992. The day that would forever be burned into British financial memory as Black Wednesday, though Soros himself would later prefer to call it White Wednesday, began before dawn in the currency markets. As Asian and European markets opened in the early hours, the pound came under immediate and ferocious selling pressure. Currency traders, large banks, investment funds, and private speculators were dumping sterling by the billions. The Bank of England, under its governor Robin Lee Pemberton, swung into action. Its mandate was clear: defend the pound, keep it within its ERM band, do whatever it took. And so the bank began buying pounds, vast quantities of pounds, using its foreign currency reserves to absorb the selling and prop up the exchange rate. In the first hour alone, the bank spent over £1 billion of its reserves, then another billion, then another. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with open hands. Chancellor of the Exchequer Norman Lamont arrived at the Treasury early that morning with the look of a man who already knew the battle was going badly. The numbers coming in from the currency desks were brutal. The pound was not holding. For every billion the Bank of England spent buying sterling, the market swallowed it and pushed the rate lower. Lamont spoke to John Major by telephone. The Prime Minister, a careful, measured man who had staked his political credibility on Britain's membership in the ERM, urged that the line be held. Britain could not afford the humiliation of devaluation. It would shatter confidence in his government. It would signal weakness to Europe. It had to be defended. But in the towers of Midtown Manhattan, George Soros was not sleeping. He had been awake through the night, monitoring the markets with the cold concentration of a surgeon. His fund was now committed. The trade was live. $10 billion in borrowed British pounds had been sold into the market. Every penny the pound fell in value would translate into profit. Every penny it rose would translate into loss. The position was enormous, larger than the GDP of many small nations, and it was moving in exactly the direction Druckenmiller had predicted. By mid-morning, the Bank of England had exhausted its first wave of defensive buying. The pound was still sliding. At 11 o'clock, the British government made its first desperate move. Lamont announced an emergency interest rate hike from 10% to 12%. A 2 percentage point increase announced mid-morning in a crisis, an almost unheard-of intervention in modern British financial history. The message to the markets was clear. Britain was serious. Britain would pay whatever price was necessary to defend the pound. Traders paused for a moment. The pound twitched. And then, nothing. The market absorbed the announcement and kept selling. The interest rate hike had failed. Inside the Bank of England, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to something close to dread. The reserves were bleeding out at a catastrophic rate. Estimates later suggested that the bank spent somewhere between 15 and 27 billion pounds in a single day attempting to defend sterling, a staggering sum that drained the United Kingdom's foreign exchange reserves to near critical levels. And still, the pound kept falling. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Lamont emerged from a meeting with John Major and announced a second emergency interest rate hike. The rate would rise again, from 12% to a barely credible 15%. 15%. In a country already mired in recession, with millions of homeowners on variable rate mortgages, a 15% interest rate was not just financially catastrophic. It was politically unthinkable. Mortgage payments would double. Businesses would fold. The announcement sent a shockwave through the British public. But the markets did not flinch. Because by this point, even the most casual observer of the currency war could see the truth. Britain was not defending its currency. Britain was begging the market for mercy, and the market, led by the quiet, calculating figure of George Soros in his Manhattan office, had no mercy to give. The second rate hike was never implemented. Within hours of its announcement, the British government quietly shelved it. The signal it sent was the most devastating of all, that the government itself no longer believed in what it was doing. The last psychological pillar holding up the ERM defense had been knocked away. Sterling collapsed. At 7:30 in the evening on September 16, 1992, Norman Lamont stood outside the Treasury on Horse Guards Road and made the announcement that sealed the day in British political history. Britain was suspending its membership in the exchange rate mechanism. The pound would be allowed to float freely. The ERM experiment, the cornerstone of John Major's European policy, was over. Lamont's face was pale. His voice, though controlled, carried the weight of a man who understood that he was announcing not just a policy failure, but the collapse of a government's credibility. Behind him, unseen, the political career of John Major had been mortally wounded. His government would limp on for another 5 years, but it would never fully recover from the humiliation of Black Wednesday. The Conservative Party's reputation for economic competence, built over a decade, had been shattered in a single afternoon. And in Manhattan, George Soros was calculating. The pound had fallen approximately 15% against the Deutsche Mark by the end of the day. On a $10 billion short position, that meant a profit of somewhere between $1 billion and $1.1 billion, earned in a single trading day. It was, at the time, the largest single-day currency profit in the history of private finance. The man who had survived the Nazis as a child in Budapest had just beaten the Bank of England. The news broke slowly at first, then with the force of a financial earthquake. Within days, the story was everywhere. George Soros, a name previously known mainly to professional investors, became famous across the world virtually overnight. The British press alternated between outrage and begrudging awe. Questions were asked in Parliament. Inquiries were launched. How had a single private investor been able to defeat the monetary defenses of one of the world's oldest and wealthiest nations? The answers, when they came, were deeply uncomfortable for the British establishment. The truth was that the system itself had been the vulnerability. The ERM, designed to bring European currencies into alignment, had created artificial fixed points that were only as strong as the political will behind them. And political will, unlike mathematics, has a breaking point. Soros had not created the weakness in the pound. He had simply been the one willing to bet, at a scale no one else dared, that the weakness was real, and that reality would eventually assert itself over politics. In this, he was correct. The aftermath of Black Wednesday reshaped British politics for a generation. John Major's government staggered forward under the shadow of September 16th for the remaining years of its tenure. Norman Lamont was replaced as Chancellor within a year. The Conservative Party, which had governed Britain for 13 unbroken years, was swept from power in the landslide Labour victory of 1997, with Tony Blair leading a party that had spent 5 years pointing to a single autumn afternoon as proof that the Tories could not be trusted with the British economy. But the shockwaves from Black Wednesday did not stop at Britain's borders. Across Europe, the ERM itself began to fracture. Ireland, Italy, Spain, and Portugal all faced intense speculative pressure on their currencies in the weeks and months that followed. The vision of a smooth, orderly path toward European monetary union, which leaders like Helmut Kohl of Germany and François Mitterrand of France had worked years to construct, had been severely damaged. The idea that currency pegs could be maintained indefinitely against the will of global capital markets had been exposed as a dangerous illusion, and George Soros walked away not merely a richer man, but a different kind of figure in the global imagination. He had demonstrated, with devastating clarity, that private capital, wielded with sufficient intelligence, nerve, and scale, could override the decisions of sovereign governments. In the years that followed, he would write extensively about the responsibilities that came with such power. He would fund democracy movements across Eastern Europe through his Open Society foundations. He would become one of the most controversial philanthropists and political figures of the late 20th century, loved by some, despised by others, and impossible for anyone to ignore. Stanley Druckenmiller, the strategist who first identified the trade and had the instinct to bring it to Soros, would go on to become one of the most respected macro investors of his generation, a man whose analysis of government policy and currency dynamics was studied and feared by central banks around the world. He later said in interviews that the British pound trade remained one of the clearest examples he had ever seen of a government trying to fight economic reality with political willpower and losing. Vladimir Putin, watching from the crumbling ruins of the Soviet Union in those same months of 1992, drew lessons of a different kind from the spectacle of a Western government humiliated by a private speculator. Xi Jinping, then a rising party official in China, watched with the careful attention of a man whose country maintained rigid capital controls precisely to prevent what had happened to Britain from ever happening to Beijing. Away from national power, watched as India itself struggled with its own currency crisis that same year, a crisis that would force a dramatic liberalization of the Indian economy. The ripples from one man's trade in one currency market on one September morning reached everywhere. The Bank of England, for its part, spent years analyzing the events of Black Wednesday. What had gone wrong? What could have been done differently? Whether there was any version of events in which the defense of sterling could have succeeded. The conclusions, largely internal and circulated quietly, were sobering. Against a coordinated wave of selling driven by fundamentally correct economic analysis and backed by essentially unlimited private capital, the bank's reserves, however vast, were finite. The laws of mathematics had prevailed over the institutional authority of one of the world's great central banks. There is something almost mythological about the story of September 16, 1992. A single man, with a telephone and a conviction, facing down the entire monetary establishment of a G7 nation, and winning. But the mythology obscures a harder truth. Soros did not win because he was lucky. He did not win because the system was corrupt. He won because he was right. The pound was overvalued. The British economy could not sustain the ERM commitment. The political will to defend it was paper-thin beneath the surface. All Soros did, all he ever claimed to do, was see what was true and bet on it at a scale most human beings could not conceive of. In the years since 1992, global currency markets have grown to a daily trading volume of over $7 trillion. The lesson of Black Wednesday has been absorbed, partially, by governments and central banks around the world. Most major currencies now float freely, their values set by the invisible auction of supply and demand rather than government decree. The ERM itself was superseded in 1999 by the introduction of the euro, the single currency that made intra-European exchange rate crises structurally impossible. though it created entirely different vulnerabilities, as the Greek debt crisis of 2010 would painfully demonstrate. But none of that erases what happened on a grey September morning in London in 1992. It stands alone in the history of modern finance, an event so singular, so audacious, and so perfectly executed that it has never been truly replicated. Because what Soros had, beyond the intelligence, and beyond the capital, and beyond the analytical framework, was something rarer still. He had the absolute, unshakable willingness to act on what he believed was true, even when what he believed required him to bet $10 billion against the Bank of England. He did it before dawn. He was done before nightfall. And by the time Norman Lamont stepped in front of those cameras on Horse Guards Road, George Soros was already $1 billion richer. And the world would never look at the power of private capital or the fragility of governments in quite the same way again.